Yeah, right.
So if you're here for the CEU credits, which I hope you are, but if you're not, that's okay too. Everyone's welcome. We actually scan your badge at the end, and so you'll need to stay in for the entire time. If you have your CE pass, if anybody purchased a CE pass, that you automatically get your documentation through email, or if you're an AFCM member, those are the two easiest ways to get the documentation that you've attended, right? So if you haven't become a member, if you haven't purchased a CE pass, you can still do that today. And as you scan, then it's automatically sent. Now, if neither of those apply to you, you can self-document, and I've got an email with some hints and tips about how to do that. So see me afterwards if you fit into one of those. But we'd love to have you in LCN. I think the membership rates of like $50 or even less, for students or E156. It's very, very inexpensive. So we do a lot of wonderful things: scholarships, CEUs, the conference, of course, and monthly meetings over Fort Chapter, and so there's, just really a great group. So I would encourage you to do that. Now today we have Dr. Court Chambers. He's from a very esteemed university here in Honolulu, Hawaii Pacific University, assistant professor in cybersecurity. He has many certifications. I don't want to take up too much time because I want him to have the time to talk to you about it. But we're just really fortunate to have him here to share his knowledge and experience. So I'll hand it over to you.
All right, thank you very much. And thank you all for coming. We're going to kind of do a deep dive into SolarWinds Cyberattack, a synopsis and lessons learned today, and I hope you enjoy it. I didn't go too deep into the technical side, but just enough, I think, to make it interesting and to kind of get an idea of how this attack happened and maybe some lessons learned at the end of how to avoid some of these attacks, supply chain attacks in the future. So SolarWinds Corporation is an American company that develops software for businesses to help manage their network systems and information technology. It's headquartered in Austin, Texas. It provides software for businesses to help manage their network systems and IT infrastructure. According to the company's website, the product is used by more than 300,000 organizations globally. Customers include the U.S. military, the Pentagon, the State Department, Justice Department, and the Department of Homeland Security, as well as a lot of private tech companies, including Cisco and Google and others. This report includes open source information, basically open source analysis from National Public Radio, the U.S. Government Accountability Office, and various technology and government websites. So back in the spring of 2020, SolarWinds released a software update for its customers. It was intended to deliver common fixes and optimizations for their widely used network management system called Orion. You probably heard that name before. This manages all parts of a corporate network. To get the update, the clients had to log into the development website of the firm, submit a password, then receive a digitally signed download to their servers. So let's watch a really quick video, just a couple of minutes of it, to get the effect of how this broke in the news.
We've got a developing story to talk about. The U.S. Treasury and Commerce Department among the federal agencies that were victim of a massive
cyber attack on the U.S. government was far more wide-reaching than previously thought.
Unprecedented in audacity and scope.
From a software engineering perspective, it's probably fair to say that this is the largest and most sophisticated attack the world has ever seen.
Nestled in the southern tech hub of Austin, SolarWinds doesn't exactly loom large among recognised IT brand names, yet there's a little bit of it in nearly all of them. Microsoft, Google, Intel, and just for good measure, inside the systems that power the US Justice Department, Treasury, Homeland Security, and even nuclear security at the Department of Energy. To anyone with malicious intent, that made SolarWinds the perfect target for digital spycraft. Compromised software used to manage large networks and in turn gain access to those networks. Perhaps there's no surprise someone saw the potential. The bigger shock is just how easy it was.
The footholds these hackers gained into private networks, including some of the world's largest IT vendor, may provide opportunities for future intrusions for years to come.
The centrepiece of the SolarWinds platform is a system called Orion. Programmers collaborate, writing software code and saving it on, in this case, a place called GitHub. But
All right, we're going to stop there. So after extensive research and interviews with those involved in the breach, including victims, corporate figures, and cyber analysts, NPR conducted a very comprehensive review of this historic attack. Their conclusion was that it was clear that a highly advanced actor had targeted a vulnerable part of our digital lives, the simple software update. And we're all familiar with this. We get the security pop-up on our iPhone or on our MacBook or Windows laptop that says, security patch will be installed. You can install it now and click here, or it will be installed later this evening. So this is just something that is part of our life. So when the individuals install this digital software update, these are signed. They're digitally signed. They have a signed certificate that proves they're from the manufacturer, and people say, hey, if it's from the manufacturer and it's digitally signed, it's good to go. So their conclusion was that it was clear that a highly advanced actor had targeted a vulnerable part of our lives, and that was that simple software update. In 2020, the U.S. administration worked frantically to address the repercussions of this attack. The analysis undertaken by various cybersecurity and government organizations has surmised that the Russian intelligence had found their way into a multitude of entities, including but not limited to Microsoft, Intel, and Cisco, as well as various government departments like the Treasury, Justice, and Energy departments and the Pentagon. And you can imagine how robust the security is at Intel, Cisco, Microsoft, the Pentagon. So this was a feat to get into these systems. There was even an infiltration of the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, which is tasked with protecting federal computer networks against cyber attacks. The execution of the Russian tradecraft took the U.S. by surprise. The hidden aspects of the behind-the-scenes technology that's crucial in network monitoring operations is extremely complex. With top-notch programs like Orion, IT departments can easily manage their entire network from one screen, including servers, firewalls, and even printers. And this is typically referred to as a single pane of glass. Due to its extensive access, it was ingenious to hack this particular software. The attacker was highly skilled and calculated. As the Russian hackers penetrated the government's cybersecurity defenses, it became increasingly clear that they were working with a level of sophistication far beyond what anyone had anticipated. It was also predicted that with the same access that allowed the threat actors to steal data, they could also demolish or encrypt it at lightning speed, a pace much faster than the defenders could possibly respond to.
they invented a malicious software update package called Sunburst. When the big network customers were infected with it, their systems were at the hackers' mercy. Those customers weren't just America's biggest digital enterprises, they were global too. The UK's National Health Service, the European Parliament, even a NATO agency.
It's a little bit like a burglar who wants to break into a single apartment but manages to turn off the alarm system for every home and every building in the entire city. Everybody's safety is put at risk, and that is what we're grappling with here.
18,000 targets were hit, and hackers hung around undetected inside many for at least 9 months in some cases.
This is a sophisticated actor who did their best to hide their tracks. We believe it took them months to plan and execute this compromise. It'll take us some time to uncover this layer by layer.
Now, America's security agencies and its brightest tech minds had just been overrun and, in their line of work, professionally embarrassed. But their dismay soon gave way to two burning questions. Who were these raiders, and what did they want?
One of the reasons the SolarWinds hack has been especially concerning is that it was not detected by the multi-billion-dollar U.S. government cybersecurity enterprise.
Forensic evidence suggests it was the work of a group known as Cozy Bear. Nothing cuddly about them, though. It's the code name for a branch of Russian intelligence with many, many digital claws.
And we asked ourselves, how many engineers did we believe had worked on this collective effort? And the answer we came to was at least 1,000. I should say at least 1,000 very skilled, capable engineers.
So 1,000 engineers from the Russian intelligence worked on this project. So let's take just a walk through the process of how this evolved. First, the threat actor accessed SolarWinds network in number one. Number two, they tested code in the SolarWinds environment. Basically, they dropped a small piece of code inside the development as it was going through, as Orion was being developed. And then they checked that malicious code to make sure that it came in the build. And once they knew it did, the threat actor added the malicious code to the Orion software updates. Number four, customers downloaded and installed the software updates containing the malicious code. Number five, the malicious code beacons threat actors' infrastructure to alert the actor of vulnerable customer networks. Number six, the actor uses malicious command and control to gain access to the system's customer networks. And then number seven, the threat actor moved through the customer networks to gather information and steal data. And we're going to kind of go into details of each one of these steps as we move through this process. So the Russian SVR intelligence service that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes utilized this routine software update to insert malicious code into Orion software, leading to one of the most complex cyber attacks against the U.S. in history. SolarWinds President and CEO Sudhakar Ramakrishna estimated that 18,000 customers downloaded the code between March and June of 2020. Although the actual number of impacted customers was far less, approximately 100 organizations, both public and private. And the reason that it was less was because the Russian intelligence services were actually picking and choosing who they attacked. So you can't see this very well. I'm just going to explain it to you very briefly, the timeline, because we're going to actually go through it as we get deeper into the topic. But back in September 4th of 2019, hackers started accessing SolarWinds. They started injecting this test code, basically that little snippet of test code that they could see if it would actually go into the build. On November 4th of that year, 2019 now, they stopped testing because they had seen results. Their snippet was in the build. So they went back to the drawing board and they started developing the software that would eventually take down or go into the SolarWinds update. They created a SolarWinds backdoor and deployed it in February of 2020. In March was the estimated start of distribution of the SolarWinds backdoor and the distribution of Sunburst and targeting profiling. So they started distributing Sunburst, which was the malware, and then they started profiling to see which targets they wanted to attack. In May is the estimated start of the hands-on keyboard attack. So in other words, this is all automatic up to this point. The code was running on its own. It was pinging out to its command and control servers. And then in May, they started hands-on keyboards to manipulate the attack. On June 4th, attackers removed the malware from SolarWinds' build environment, but they continued their hands-on keyboard activity. And then later, in December 12th of 2020, so this is almost a year, the SolarWinds supply chain attack was disclosed, and we're going to talk about how they determined that their systems were hacked. So the threat actors roamed around inside some American computer networks for approximately 9 months, and it's still unknown whether they were just surveilling emails and gathering intelligence, or if their intentions had been far more vicious in nature, leaving something behind that could be unleashed at a later date. The hackers utilized some innovative techniques to carry out the attack, like adjusting sealed software code and creating a system that leveraged domain names to select targets. They camouflaged their moves by manipulating Orion's communication procedures. To clean the crime scene, they scrubbed all digital evidence in a way that left no traceable proof as to who was responsible. Adam Myers, the vice president for threat intelligence at CrowdStrike, was interviewed by NPR concerning the attack. He took part in the investigation of the Sony hack back in 2014, which North Korea conducted by infiltrating their servers and revealing emails and first-run movies. Then a year later, he was tackling the breach caused by Cozy Bear, who stole emails from the DNC and sent them to WikiLeaks ahead of the 2016 elections. The beginning of the SolarWinds hack was actually traced back to September 12th, 2019. Myers noticed a small line of code that seemed at first glance to be just checking the system. All it appeared to do was determine whether the computer's processor was 32 or 64-bit, and then it returned to 0 or 1. Myers explained that the code fragment was basically a proof of concept, a little trial balloon to see if it was possible to modify SolarWinds' signed and sealed software code, get it published, and then later see it in a download version. So they were using this trial balloon to see if their theory worked. And when the attackers realized it would work, that was at the point they knew they could pull off the supply chain attack. They knew they had the capability at this point. After their initial successes, the hackers vanished for 5 months. They reappeared in February 2020 carrying a unique new implant that inserted a backdoor into the software before it was published, and that's the key, before the software was published. To grasp why this was exceptional, Myers explained, you need to be aware that the final software code has a sort of digital factory seal. Basically, it's digitally signed with an encrypted signature. If the seal is broken, someone can observe it and recognize that the coding could have been meddled with. Myers explained that the hackers essentially discovered a way to get past that factory seal. They did this by implanting code that would inform them whenever someone from SolarWinds' developing team got ready to construct new software. They were aware that the procedure of designing software or an update generally begins with something commonplace, such as taking out code out of a digital repository. In this case, it was GitHub. This is comparable to checking out a book from the library, reading it, and then returning it. Typically, developers take coding from a repository, make changes, and then they check it back in. After they complete the adjustments, they would initiate something labeled as a build process, which basically converts the code humans can interpret to the code computers can utilize. At that point, the code is considered clean and verified. And what occurred after that was what fooled everyone. The malicious actors used a form of bait and switch tactic in which to execute their plan. First, they made a temporary update file containing the malicious code while the SolarWinds code was compiling. Afterwards, the system was instructed by the code to replace the SolarWinds version with the hacker's version at the very last second. just as the updates were transitioning from readable source code to executable code. This step is a routine for practice for companies such as SolarWinds to audit their code prior to its release. It's important to note the switch had to be perfectly timed so that it went undetected. SolarWinds customers received a nefarious version of the software that would give cyber intruders unrestricted concealed access to whoever deployed the update and was connected to the web. But there was also something else about the code that bothered Myers. It wasn't just for SolarWinds. When they looked at it, it could have been reconfigured for any number of software products. In other words, any number of other software developers using the same compiler may also be on the receiving end of the cyber attack, and they just didn't know it yet. Myers noted the thought hackers put into this operation was extraordinary. The way they identified targets, the downside of breaking into so many customer networks all at once is that it's hard to decide who to exploit first. So the hackers created a passive domain name server, or DNS, that sent little messages, not just with an IP address, but also with a thumbnail profile of the potential target. So they had these multitude of targets, but they only wanted the biggest fish, so they went through a process of evaluating who to attack. The hackers also reverse engineered the way Orion communicated with the servers and built their own coding instructions mimicking Orion's syntax and formats. So if anyone had been watching the coding, the communication, they would have seen what appeared to be Orion's syntax. What that did is allow the hackers to look like they were speaking Orion, so their message traffic could look like a natural extension of the software.
The SolarWinds hack was what is known as a supply chain attack.
What's unique about this, or special about this particular intrusion, is that they used the access that they got by compromising SolarWinds itself to insert malware into the build process. This then allowed them to target SolarWinds customers that deployed this backdoor update.
They pushed this update out, which allowed them to essentially put malicious code on any customer of SolarWinds that had the Orion platform in place, and then have access to their infrastructure. Some of the companies that were involved: Microsoft, Cisco, Intel, a lot of Department of Defense type organizations, federal government installations, big companies that were impacted by this.
These updates were signed off on by the original vendor, and there was no reason to suspect that they were compromised or a threat to other systems. And the intrusion was uncovered by the cybersecurity company FireEye. The reaction to the hack by members of the US government when it was revealed to the public was stark.
When Moonlight Maze, a quite comparable Russian intrusion set or campaign, was discovered in the late 1990s, the same thing happened. People called it cyber war, an attack against the United States, but the same thing was true then that is true today, namely that we're looking at most likely a sophisticated form of intelligence collection, of espionage, not at an attack.
All right, so the following is a malware analysis from FireEye threat research post on December 13th, 2020. FireEye uncovered a widespread campaign that they were tracking as UNC 2452. The attackers behind the campaign gained access to numerous public and private organizations around the world via Trojanized updates to SolarWinds Orion IT monitoring and management software. Post-compromise activity following the supply chain compromise included lateral movement and data theft. It was apparent the campaign was the work of a highly skilled actor, and the operation was conducted with significant operational security. FireEye tracked the Trojanized version of this SolarWinds Orion plugin known as Sunburst. A SolarWinds digitally signed component of the Orion software framework, or dynamic link library, a DLL file, that contained a backdoor communicated via HTTP to third-party servers. After an initial dormant period of up to 2 weeks, so basically the software would wait the malware would wait 2 weeks before it initiated to avoid attack detection. So after this period of 2 weeks, the malware retrieved and executed commands called jobs that included the ability to transfer files, execute files, profile the system, reboot the machine, and disable system services. The malware masqueraded its network traffic as the Orion Improvement Program, OIP protocol, and stored reconnaissance results within legitimate plug-in configuration files. This allowed it to blend in with legitimate SolarWinds activity. The backdoor uses multiple block lists to identify forensic and antivirus tools running as processes, services, and drivers. Multiple Trojanized updates were digitally signed from March to May 2020 and posted to the SolarWinds Updates website. The Trojanized update files were standard Windows installer patch files that included compressed resources associated with the update, including that DLL file component. The National Security Agency and the military's U.S. Cyber Command were also caught off guard. They typically observe networks from a distance to catch any suspicious activity before it happens. However, in this case, they didn't detect anything out of the ordinary with Russian intelligence agency activities. The hackers managed to move unseen and undetectable into U.S. networks by not doing anything too complicated. To avoid detection, they rented command and control servers in the U.S. from Amazon and GoDaddy. So when the software, the remote access Trojan, would ping out to its command and control servers, the command and control servers were in the U.S. They were Amazon and GoDaddy servers. After approximately 3 months, a California cybersecurity company known as Palo Alto Networks found a malicious backdoor that seemed to originate from the Orion program. Then, as mentioned by SolarWinds CEO, the security team from both SolarWinds and Palo Alto collaborated for several months to investigate the issue. There was not any clear indication of a supply chain attack at that time, so the ticket was terminated. According to the NPR report, the cybersecurity firm FireEye identified the intrusion after one of its security team noted that an employee had 2 mobile phones registered on their network, voice over IP phones. This prompted them to call the worker, and they were able to uncover what was happening.
FireEye, the cybersecurity company that discovered the hack, only found out because it too was a victim of the SolarWinds intrusion.
It was kind of by happenstance or mistake. And so what had happened is FireEye leverages something called multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication. And one of the users inside of FireEye got a request to reset their multi-factor authentication, which they had not done. And so really good. This is where education awareness and employee awareness really comes into play here. Without that, FireEye may have not discovered this breach in the first place, and the attackers may still have access to all of these systems. We would never know about it.
They suspect the breach went undetected for something like 8 months.
U.S. security officials are just beginning to discover how widespread the intrusion is, acknowledging that it targeted at least the Treasury, Commerce, State, and Homeland Security departments and may have hit the Pentagon.
What the retaliation is going to be, and I think it ought to be whatever we assess the cost we have incurred to be plus.
So firms like FireEye and Symantec, right, they are in the job of defense. And to defend in this world, which is very much kind of based on open source information sharing and communities of practice, you need to be able to get that information out there as soon as possible. So I think FireEye absolutely did the right thing because many of not only their customers, but civilian firms and civil society around the world were exposed to this threat.
So after weeks of investigations, FireEye uncovered the evidence that an outsider had infiltrated their network and taken possession of the company's collection of their cybersecurity tools. FireEye contacted the FBI, producing a thorough report that pointed to the Orion software as the cause. The malicious coding had permitted access to FireEye's network, so it was reasoned that other parties could also be affected. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that there was just not a random attack, but a deliberate and well-planned operation with the potential to cause widespread damage. The backdoor had been carefully designed to evade detection and remain undetected for an extended period, which indicated that the attackers were highly skilled and had a deep knowledge of the software. The company collaborated with DHS to create a public announcement on December 13, 2020. A thorough examination of the cyber attack needed to be conducted, and SolarWinds had to collect digital evidence, backup files, and monitor custody records while trying their best to make sure that the hackers were not still inside their system and observing everything they did. So this is a statement from then President and CEO Kevin Thompson, and basically they just released this statement. This is again in December of 2020. They released this statement stating that their systems had been infiltrated, and they were acting in close coordination with FireEye, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the intelligence community, and other law enforcement to investigate the attack. SolarWinds also worked feverishly to put out a mitigation strategy. So they worked very hard to upgrade to a new platform version, and they urged their customers to install this new version as soon as possible to ensure the security of their environment. If their customers weren't sure which version of the Orion platform they were using, there was directions on how to find what version they were using. If they could not upgrade immediately, there were guidelines also to follow. And then in December 15, 2020, they released another hot fix release, and they recommended that all customers update the release to 2020.2.1. Mandiant FireEye also published a threat notification. Basically, they said that FireEye had uncovered a widespread campaign that they were tracking as UNC 2452. They stated that a digitally signed component of the Orion software framework contains a backdoor that communicates via HTTP to third-party servers. They were tracking it as Sunburst. After an initial dormant period of up to 2 weeks, it retrieves and executes commands called jobs that disable system services. And multiple Trojanized updates were signed from March to May 2020. By mid-January, Myers and the CrowdStrike team had identified a minuscule yet crucial segment of code that may have been released related to the attacker. It was a concise, encrypted piece that had a mere 3,500 lines to it. This is characteristics also often found in well-crafted coding programming. This little encrypted strip could give them an indication of who conducted the assault. As the researchers from CrowdStrike worked to break the encryption, it became clear that no useful evidence had been left behind. The digital equivalent of a clean sweep had been done. At that point, they knew only a highly advanced individual or group with nation-state backing would have the resources and skills necessary to completely cover their tracks. The SolarWinds attack exposed U.S. tech giants and high-level government agencies. Early alerts from Volexity, followed by investigations by Palo Alto Networks, plus a revelation made by an independent cybersecurity specialist in India, were all overlooked. This laying bare the frailty of our digital landscape at that time. Intelligence professionals are anticipating future unpleasant possibilities from this attack. Could these threat actors have planted malware during their infiltration of SolarWinds in order to gain access sometime down the line? This is feasible given the events of 2015 involving Ukraine's power grid, and in 2016 with Saudi Arabia's refinery, where malicious computer coding was used to create disruption and had been planted earlier in the system. We will eventually discover that the hack of SolarWinds may have had deeper purposes. Cybersecurity firm Symantec recently stated it identified another malware strain that was used during the SolarWinds supply chain attack, bringing the total number to 4 after the likes of Sunspot, Sunburst, and Teardrop. Named Raindrop, Symantec said the malware was used only during the very last stages of an intrusion, deployed only on the networks of very few selected targets. Symantec said it encountered only 4 Raindrop samples in all of the cases it investigated. And to just do a short deep dive into these 4 different strains that were found in SolarWinds, to understand Raindrop's role and position in these attacks, we must first go over the timeline of the SolarWinds incident. Based on reports and information published by Microsoft, FireEye, CrowdStrike, and others, the intruders first deployed the Sunspot malware, which they used exclusively inside SolarWinds' own network. CrowdStrike said the attackers used the malware to modify the build process of the SolarWinds Orion app and insert Sunburst malware inside new versions of Orion, an IT inventory management system. These Trojanized Orion versions went undetected and were active on the official SolarWinds update servers between March and June. We talked about that a little earlier. Companies who applied Orion updates also installed the malware. But the Sunburst malware wasn't particularly complex and didn't do much except gather information about the infected network and send the data to the remote servers. Even if around 18,000 SolarWinds customers got themselves infected with the Sunburst malware, the Russian hacking group carefully selected its targets and opted to escalate attacks only in a handful of cases for the likes of high-profile targets such as U.S. government agencies, Microsoft, or the security firm FireEye. When the hackers decided to escalate their access, they used Sunburst to download and install the Teardrop malware. Raindrop was Teardrop's sibling. But Symantec says that in some cases the hackers choose to deploy Raindrop malware strain instead of the more widely used Teardrop. Despite being different strains, Symantec said the 2 backdoors had similar functionality, which the company described as being a loader of the Cobalt strike beacon, which intrudes later used to escalate and broaden access inside the hacked network. But while both Raindrop and Teardrop were used for the same purpose, Symantec said that some differences also exist between the two, most being under the hood at the code level. The other major difference is how the 2 malware strains were deployed. Symantec said that the more likely used Teardrop was installed directly by Sunburst malware, while Raindrop mysteriously appeared on systems where Sunburst was also found, with no direct evidence that Sunburst triggered its installation. The most obvious avenue is found in previous reports on the SolarWinds hacks that mention that hackers also used Sunburst malware to run various fileless PowerShell payloads, many of which would leave minimal forensic evidence on the infected hosts. While unconfirmed, it may be possible that Raindrop is a result of these operations. So just a quick overview of these 4 different malware strains used in the attack. The problems may not be over for SolarWinds. The SolarWinds Securities and Exchange Commission recently announced on October 30th, 2023, charges against the Austin, Texas-based software company and its chief information security officer for fraud and internal control failures relating to allegedly cybersecurity risk and vulnerabilities. So the SEC basically is filing charges against SolarWinds. The White House clearly stated that the threat actors were part of the Russian intelligence, but Russia has denied any involvement in the incident. So who are these attackers? Well, Cozy Bear, as mentioned before, classified by the United States federal government as an advanced persistent threat APT-29, is a Russian hacker group believed to be associated with the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR. repeatedly demonstrates a high level of post-exploitation proficiency, particularly involving the enumeration of and lateral movement within cloud environments. So APT-29 now is focusing heavily on cloud environments. On 8 December 2020, FireEye disclosed that a collection of their proprietary cybersecurity research tools had been stolen, possibly by a nation with top-tier offensive capabilities. SolarWinds clients were exposed to sunburst, including several U.S. federal agencies. The Washington Post's sources identified Cozy Bear as the group responsible for the attack. These state-sponsored threat actors have been in existence for a while, and they've launched other notable attacks. The first is called NotPetya. You may have heard of this in the past. This is back on Tuesday, June 27, 2017. The world's engaged with one of the most destructive malware ever developed. The disaster ushered in a new kind of state-sponsored cyber warfare with Ukraine. APT-29 group launched NotPetya, which infiltrated every Ukrainian network and also took hold of computer systems across Europe, UK, and around the world. NotPetya had some recognizable features of its 2016 predecessor, the ransomware Petya, as well as the May 2017 WannaCry ransomware. You probably heard that name before. NotPetya delivered more than $10 billion in damage globally. Like the WannaCry malware, it also uses the Eternal Blue vulnerability to spread. It harvests credentials from the infected machines and uses other techniques to move laterally throughout a network and to infect other machines in the network. Fancy Bear, or APT-28. APT-28 is associated with the Special Services Russia's main intelligence directorate, the GRU. Earlier in its operational lifespan, when conducting victim exploration and credential collection, the adversary used spear phishing emails containing malicious documents or links that redirected to malicious infrastructure. Credential harvesting plays a significant role in Fancy Bear's acquisition of intelligence to target information, to target individuals or organizations. This is probably a hack you may remember in the past. This is another attack, the 2016 Hillary Clinton campaign. Attack was orchestrated by APT-28. In March 2016, the personal Gmail account of John Podesta, the presidential chief of staff, was hacked. Experts believe the Russian cyber group APT-28, Fancy Bear, launched the attack. The way it worked was Mr. Podesta used a Gmail account to handle all of his email. This is a screenshot of the actual spear phishing email that John Podesta received. So on the left-hand side of the screen, he received this email, and we probably all received a lot of emails that look just like this. Google says, you receive an email from Google. It says someone has just used your password trying to enter your Google account. Details, it said it was March 19th, IP address, location Ukraine. Google stopped this sign-in attempt for you. You should change your password immediately. Well, that's good advice, right? Whenever we have a anonymous login to our system, maybe our Google account, that we're going to make sure we change our password, make sure that it hasn't been hacked into. So, being the presidential chief of staff, he's talked to his assistant and said, let's check with the IT department before we do anything, just to make sure that this is legit. So his administrative assistant sent the email to the IT department. The IT department quickly responded, and they said, Google has stopped this sign-in attempt, and you should change your password immediately. And then it offered a legitimate link to change his password. And this legitimate link you can see right here. They asked him to go to https myaccountgoogle.com security and change his password. But unknowingly, Mr. Podesta actually clicked this that was in the APT-28's email, which was a bit.ly link And Podesta's messages, email messages, at least 50,000 of them were now in the hackers' hands. Many of them were later released on WikiLeaks. This was right before the 2016 election. So what is the Russian SVR? The Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation, or SVR, is Russia's external intelligence agency focusing mainly on civilian affairs. The SVR succeeded the first chief directorate PGU of the KGB in December 1991. The SVR has its headquarters in Moscow. Unlike the Russian Federal Security Service, the FSB, the SVR is tasked with intelligence and espionage activities outside the Russian Federation. It works together with the Russian Main Intelligence Directorate, or the GRU. The SVR is also authorized to negotiate anti-terrorist cooperation and intelligence sharing arrangements with foreign intelligence agencies and provides analysis and dissemination of intelligence to the Russian president. So the main directorate of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, formerly the Main Intelligence Directorate, and still commonly known by its abbreviation GRU, is the Foreign Military Intelligence Agency of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Federal Russian Federation. The GRU controls the military intelligence service and maintains its own special units. So unlike Russia's other security and intelligence agencies, such as the SVR, those heads report directly to the President of Russia. The director of the GRU reports to the defense and chief of the general staff of the Russian military. The directorate is Russia's largest foreign intelligence agency and is distinguished among its counterparts for its willingness to execute risky and complicated high-stakes operations. So let's talk about a few lessons learned from the attacks. Going forward, companies should ramp up cybersecurity training and awareness. They should regularly conduct emergency response drills. All the experts encourage collaboration between government and private entities. Suspicions, threats, and unusual activity must be reported. Third-party vendors are the weakness in supply chains, the weakest link in supply chains. The more there are, the more vulnerable the system is. Companies can better manage their supply chains and fortify against attacks by following lessons learned from the SolarWinds hack and best practices. So information sharing. Cybersecurity experts can't mitigate potential threats without detailed information about hacks that have already happened. So the analysts must study old attacks that have already taken place to prepare for new attacks. SolarWinds, FireEye, and Microsoft have been very forthcoming about the recent hack and about how vulnerabilities in their systems could have allowed it. Embrace artificial intelligence. We all know that artificial intelligence is on the horizon, and in some cases it's already here. Companies have to know where classified data is stored and who has access to it along the chain. Humans just aren't up to the task of constantly monitoring huge, complex networks for threats. So in other words, some of these networks are so huge and so complex that it overwhelms the Security Operations Center, the analysts in the center. So they need to rely on AI to leverage and possibly do it for them to flag odd behavior in real time so that they don't spend all their time chasing tickets. Nth party relationships and supply chain risk management, even at an organization with strict protocols in place, is only as secure as the weakest link in its supply chain. This should motivate companies to insist on greater oversight all the way from first-tier vendors down to nth parties. Nth parties are third-party vendors. Everyone at every level should have the tightest security controls in place. Cyber threat actors' tactics and methods evolve in parallel with the cybersecurity improvements and Staying a step ahead calls for expert advice. The National Institutes of Standards and Technology publishes an up-to-date detailed list of countermeasures to protect companies. So let's take a look at some of these NIST cyber supply chain security principles. The first is develop your defenses based on the principle that your systems will be breached. When one starts from the premise that a breach is inevitable, it changes the decision matrix on the next steps. The question becomes not just how to prevent a breach, but how to mitigate an attacker's ability to exploit the information they have accessed and how to recover from the breach. So basically what they're saying is we're going to be breached. You just have to prepare for that breach. Number two, cybersecurity is never just a technology problem. It's a people, processes, and knowledge problem. Breaches tend to be less about a technology failure and more about human error. IT security systems won't secure critical information and intellectual property unless employees throughout the supply chain use secure cybersecurity practices. Number three, security is security. There should be no gap between physical and cybersecurity. Sometimes the bad guys exploit lapses in physical security in order to launch a cyber attack. By the same token, an attacker looking for ways into a physical location might exploit cyber vulnerabilities to get access. So, key cyber supply chain risks. Let's go over some of these risks. Cybersecurity chain risks cover a lot of territory. Some of the concerns from risks include third-party service providers or vendors, from janitorial services to software engineering, with physical or virtual access to information systems, software code, or IP. Poor information security practices by lower-tier suppliers. Compromised software or hardware purchased from suppliers. Software security vulnerabilities in supply chain management or supplier systems. Counterfeit hardware or hardware with embedded malware. And third-party data storage or data aggregators. And then we're going to talk just for a couple of minutes about examples of cybersecurity chain best practices. Companies have adopted a variety of practices that help them manage their cybersecurity chain risks. And again, this is all from this NIST briefing, and it's available online. These practices include security requirements that are included in every RFP and contract. Once a vendor is accepted into the formal supply chain, a security team works with them on site to address any vulnerabilities and security gaps. So in other words, the company who has hired them actually sends a team or has a team work with them to make sure their security is up to speed. A one strike and you're out policy with respect to vendor products that either counterfeit or do not match specifications. So if you get equipment that doesn't match specifications, it's one strike and you're out. Component purchases are tightly controlled. Component purchases from approved vendors are pre-qualified. Parts purchased from other vendors are unpacked, inspected, and x-rayed before accepted. Secure software lifecycle development programs and training for all engineers in the lifecycle are established. Source code is obtained for all the purchased software. Software and hardware have a security handshake. Security booting processes look for authentication codes, and the system will not boot if codes are not recognized. Automation of manufacturing and testing regimes reduces the risk of human intervention. Track and trace programs establish in all parts of components and systems. Programs capture as built component identity data for each assembly and automatically link to the component identity data to sourcing information. Personnel in charge of supply chain cybersecurity partner with every team that touches any part of the production development lifecycle and ensures cybersecurity is part of the suppliers and developers' employee experience, process, and tools. And that's extremely important because that's basically how this supply chain attack happened. Legacy support for end-of-life products and platforms assure continued supply of authorized IP and parts. Tight controls on access by service vendors are imposed. Access to software is limited to very few vendors. Hardware vendors are limited to mechanical systems with no access to control systems. And all vendors are authorized and escorted anytime they enter the premises. All right, so this was an overview of the SolarWinds cyber attack. We tracked it from beginning to end. We also looked at several of the malware specimens that were found inside the system. And all of this information is available readily on the internet. Again, this was just an open source brief, an aggregation of a lot of information over that period from 2019 into December 2020 and beyond. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Is there any questions from anyone I can help answer?
I have a question.
Yes.
Most defenses of today's networks include looking at threat intelligence.
Correct.
The reason they were able to bypass some of that capability in the defense system was because they were going to Google, they were going to
GoDaddy, yeah.
And Amazon.
Yeah, correct.
So the threat intelligence saw that as legitimate websites to go to, and that's why they were able to bypass it.
Yeah, what happens typically when you have a remote access Trojan, what this is once a remote access Trojan gets into your system, it pings out or it tries to communicate with the mothership, right? So it's command and control servers. So a lot of security operations centers, as the threat hunters are watching the network and they see these pings out, they can see them pinging out of the network. And a lot of times it's what's called a PUP, or just it's a software program that's not malicious. It's just pinging out for an update or something. Well, if they see it pinging out to Russia or Ukraine or some Eastern Bloc country, right, first thing they would do is block it.
Right.
Because, that would bring up their suspicion, right? But if they see it pinging out to GoDaddy, I think they were planning on, when the threat hunters were looking at the pings, because they handled a lot of these a day. They may have 100 different software programs pinging out of their network in a single day, right? So this is a routine task that they go through. And because they saw it going to GoDaddy, they probably just thought, oh, that's not a threat, it's not going to Eastern Europe, look at the next one, right? So I think they were using social engineering tactics by saying, even if a threat hunter in a security operations center sees the pings, they're probably not going to react as if the pings are going outside the U.S. So that's why they rented those Amazon and GoDaddy websites, servers, as more as a social engineering technique to try to obfuscate their activities. Let's see, any other questions and comments, anyone? Okay, yeah, yes, please.
Is there a cost? Have any of these, like SolarWinds or other agencies or other vendors, paid a cost for not securing their network?
Well, they have not yet, but they will now, because they're being sued by the SEC for lax security procedures. However, and this is one thing I think it's important to bring up, I've looked at a lot of information threat intelligence, and basically the consensus of cybersecurity experts, and please someone let me know if this is incorrect, is that if you have a nation state with unlimited capabilities and 1,000 engineers, software engineers focusing on your company, the statistical chances of them not getting in other words, they're going to get in. They may not get in today or they may not get in next week, but if you have that kind of robust capacity after your system, they're going to get inside. So SolarWinds is probably going to have to pay some, fines and that type of thing, but you think of any company, especially a supply chain company who doesn't have the robust security that the NSA has or the Department of Homeland Security, they're not much of a match against a nation state with up to 1,000 engineers working 40 hours a week trying to figure out a way into their system. Does that make sense? I mean, I think, so any other questions, or sir?
So if they have about 1,000 skilled hackers,
Right.
why didn't they exploit all of the systems that they breached? If there are 18,000 networks breached.
Because it is from what I have read, what I have researched, they were very interested in exploiting information, and they only wanted information from those particular organizations. And it was like one of the individuals said in the video, it's like they were going to rob a couple of houses in the neighborhood, and they cut off the power to the entire city. So in other words, they had all these targets, and then they had all these breaches, and they were overloaded, so they just had to pick the ones that they wanted. And then the biggest worry is because these Russian intelligence services used similar tactics against Ukraine back in 2017. They got into their systems, and then they left their systems, but they left booby traps in there so that they could come back, shut down their power grid, shut down their computer systems. So that's one of the biggest worries, is if they were ingenious enough to get into these systems like Intel and Google and Microsoft and the Pentagon and the State Department, the Treasury, you can imagine what kind of robust cybersecurity they have. If they were ingenious enough to get into the systems, did they leave something inside that would maybe execute at a later date? Yes?
You mentioned that there were some early detections prior to the FireEye's reporting.
Correct.
What happened to that? What was
There was a ticket created. Palo Alto created a ticket because they had heard, or they had done some research, and they had heard from some other individuals that contacted them. They did a preliminary investigation, and you have to think at this time nobody was suspicious of anything, right? So it was probably one of those routine, let's check it, let's get with SolarWinds, let's talk about some things, look into things. And at a certain point they decided there wasn't a breach, and then they closed that ticket. So it was a missed opportunity. Sir?
I think you briefly touched on it, but would the CISO be under fire from the SEC and going after him? Does that set the precedence for all the CISOs in all the other various private companies? Because I think that might be like a contentious debate, because I think there's some that are kind of frightened to take that position, and then there are some who kind of embrace it. But I'm just kind of curious, from your professional opinion, does that actually set the precedence to for the SEC to go after individual personnel?
See, that's the scary part, and that's what kind of I touched on a few minutes earlier. The consensus of most of the cybersecurity experts that I have researched is that with a robust nation state, they will get into your system one way or another, right? So if they do set that precedent to go after the CISOs of the organizations that get breached, you know, that's going to be a bad precedent, because who can withstand the overwhelming cybersecurity effort of a nation state with 1,000 skilled hackers focusing? If they can't get in one way, they'll get in another. If they can't use technical means, they'll use social engineering means, you know? So like you were saying, it's going to set a bad precedent if the SEC is going to go after every organization that is breached, especially by a nation state, you know?
Yeah, but that's a matter of cost. If a company is not willing to put the cost
Right.
into securing their network, and,
Right.
and there should be some penalties for that.
Sure, yeah, I agree. So I guess we'll have to see. This was just filed on October 30th. Yeah. So we'll have to see how it plays out. It's going to probably be a lot of interesting information come out of that lawsuit.
During the brief, you mentioned some old TTPs that are starting to show up again.
Yeah.
In our pursuit of trying to find out the next tactics and techniques, are we not paying attention to some of the old TTPs, and are those starting to get through because we're not even focusing on them or not using tools to look for those old ones?
Yeah. Well, I think, and that plays into the attacker's hands. What we've always, you know, what a lot of the research I said, usually the weakest link is the social engineering as a human, right? So you may have the most technically advanced cybersecurity protected network, but then you've got that person in accounting that's clicking on every, you know, macro email that comes into their email box. And so I think the hackers, the very sophisticated hacking groups, especially the nation states, they're aware of that. And they test the system, they test the waters, they see if it's too technically advanced to get into the network, then they go on the social engineering side and try to find someone inside, you know, that they can get into their system. Because once they can get into one laptop, they may be able to move laterally, you know, and that's a support for make sure that all your networks are compartmentalized and you have firewalls so that even if they get into one area, they can't move laterally into the administrative privileges. That's what they want. Because most of the time in these hacks is once they get into the system, they'll use that remote access Trojan pinging out. Then they'll create a backdoor, and then when they get in the system, what they want to find is administrative privileges. Once they find that administrative password and administrative privileges, they're no longer, they become what is called living off the land. So in other words, once they have those internal admin privileges, they're part of the system now. They're not, the antiviruses won't pick them up because they're using legitimate admin privileges. So that's what they want to do, is move laterally, find those administrative privileges, and then take over the system. Let's see. Anyone else? Oh, sir?
The two-factor authentication for the mobile phones, you say the employee had 2 phones registered for two-factor authentication?
Yeah, from what I researched, there was 2 voice over IP phones, and there should only have been 1. And then when they looked into it, when FireEye looked into it, and they were going to update that multi-factor authentication, it didn't make sense. They're like, why does this guy have 2 voice over IP phones? And that second phone was a backdoor, or you know. Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you guys coming today, and hope you have a great weekend.